The story of American freedom begins long before the Declaration of Independence, in a time when a small group of colonies on the eastern edge of a vast continent dared to dream of self-determination. In the early 1600s, settlers arrived from Europe seeking opportunity, religious freedom, or simply a new life. They built towns, tilled the land, and forged communities in the face of harsh winters, unfamiliar landscapes, and often violent clashes with indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for centuries. These early settlers quickly realized that survival required cooperation, negotiation, and the establishment of rules that reflected the values of the people rather than the distant crowns they nominally served. Yet even in these early days, the tension between ideals and realities was apparent. While some sought freedom of religion and governance, others participated in systems of oppression, most notably slavery, planting a contradiction that would shadow the nation for centuries. By the mid-1600s, the colonies were beginning to experiment with self-governance. The Virginia House of Burgesses, established in 1619, became the first elected assembly in North America, a revolutionary step in a world dominated by monarchies and rigid social hierarchies. Colonists debated, voted, and passed laws reflecting their local needs, gaining a taste of liberty that was rare in the Old World. Across New England, Puritan communities held town meetings where citizens could voice opinions, shape local policies, and exercise a form of democracy that was both practical and ideological. These institutions laid the groundwork for a uniquely American understanding of freedom, one tied not only to individual rights but also to communal responsibility and civic participation. But these freedoms were fragile and limited. Native Americans were displaced, their lands taken in the name of progress. Africans were enslaved, stripped of their humanity, and forced to build the wealth that would eventually sustain the colonies. These early contradictions highlighted a recurring theme in the story of American freedom, that liberty has always existed alongside oppression, and the fight for true equality would be a struggle that extended far beyond the colonial period. Yet the ideals of self-governance, religious tolerance, and civic participation were powerful seeds that would eventually bloom into a national vision of liberty. The tension between colonial autonomy and British authority grew steadily through the 17th and 18th centuries. As the British Empire tightened its grip, imposing taxes and trade restrictions without colonial representation, the settlers began to see a fundamental conflict between the ideals they cherished and the control of a distant monarchy. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a rallying cry, reflecting a deeper desire not just for economic freedom but for political self-determination. Every new law, from the Stamp Act to the Townshend Acts, became a spark in a growing fire of resistance. Communities organized protests, boycotts, and assemblies, demonstrating that freedom was not merely an abstract principle but a tangible right worth defending. By the time 1776 arrived, the colonies had experienced decades of incremental self-rule, punctuated by protests, boycotts, and occasional violent confrontations with British forces. These experiences shaped a generation of leaders who were determined to enshrine liberty in a written document. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence boldly proclaimed that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with unalienable rights, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. This was more than a political statement. It was a declaration of ideals that would define the emerging nation and inspire people around the world. Yet even this monumental assertion of freedom carried contradictions. Women, enslaved Africans, and indigenous peoples remained largely excluded from these promises, a reminder that the journey toward true liberty was only beginning. Internationally, the birth of American freedom captured attention. In Europe, philosophers and reformers celebrated the experiment as a bold step toward modern democracy. France, inspired by the American example, would soon embrace its own revolutionary ideals, while monarchs across the continent watched with suspicion, fearful that ideas of self-rule might spread to their subjects. Even in this early stage, the United States' commitment to freedom attracted both admiration and scrutiny. Some countries saw a model of democratic governance, while others questioned the inclusivity and morality of a nation that proclaimed liberty yet tolerated slavery and displacement of native peoples. The Revolutionary War itself became a crucible for American ideals. Ordinary citizens took up arms not merely to defend property or territory, but to assert the principle that people should have the right to govern themselves. Soldiers, farmers, and intellectuals alike contributed to a cause that combined philosophy, politics, and sheer human courage. The hardships of war, hunger, disease, and the constant threat of defeat tested the very meaning of freedom. By the end of the conflict, the victory of the colonies was more than a military achievement. It was a statement to the world that liberty could be fought for, defined, and, at least partially, realized. As the United States emerged from the Revolution, it faced the daunting task of turning revolutionary ideals into sustainable governance. The Articles of Confederation initially provided a framework for self-rule, though it quickly proved inadequate in balancing state and federal powers. Debates over the Constitution highlighted the tensions inherent in freedom: how to protect individual rights while ensuring collective security, how to empower citizens without creating chaos, and how to build a nation that could inspire loyalty while respecting diversity. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, was a direct response to these challenges, safeguarding freedoms of speech, religion, assembly, and more, and cementing the philosophical foundations of the new republic. Yet, even as these documents enshrined liberty on paper, the young nation remained imperfect. Slavery persisted, women remained disenfranchised, and indigenous peoples were increasingly pushed from their lands. International observers noted both the promise and the contradictions: a nation proclaiming freedom yet practicing exclusion, a society innovating in governance yet struggling with moral and ethical dilemmas. These contradictions would shape American identity for generations to come and fuel debates that continue to resonate in modern discussions of human rights and global perception. In reflecting on the birth of American freedom, one sees a story of aspiration and contradiction, of ideals pursued imperfectly but with remarkable persistence. From the early colonial assemblies to the thunderous Declaration of Independence, from philosophical debates to battlefield sacrifices, the first chapter of American liberty sets the stage for the complex journey ahead. It is a reminder that freedom is never static. It is earned, defended, and constantly redefined. And it is this evolution, beginning in the crucible of the 17th and 18th centuries, that would make the United States both a symbol of hope and, at times, a target of scrutiny on the global stage, as nations around the world grappled with the power, promise, and contradictions of a country built on the idea that liberty should belong to all. As the United States emerged from the Revolutionary War, the young nation faced both immense opportunity and profound challenges. The promise of freedom, secured through struggle and sacrifice, now had to contend with the realities of a rapidly expanding nation. The 19th century was a period of growth, ambition, and deep contradictions, where the ideals of liberty were constantly tested against the pressures of land, wealth, and power. Westward expansion, often framed as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely ordained to spread across the continent, offered new opportunities for settlers, yet it also highlighted the tension between freedom for some and oppression for others. Native American tribes were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands through policies like the Indian Removal Act, resulting in devastating losses and the infamous Trail of Tears. This expansion, celebrated as a triumph of American ambition, came at a staggering human cost, revealing a darker side of the nation's pursuit of liberty. Meanwhile, the institution of slavery remained deeply entrenched, particularly in the southern states, creating a glaring contradiction at the heart of American freedom. The economic prosperity of the South relied on the exploitation of millions of enslaved people, while the ideals of independence and equality proclaimed in 1776 were still denied to a large portion of the population. Northern states gradually moved toward abolition, yet the nation as a whole remained divided, with debates over slavery shaping politics, culture, and regional identity. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all attempts to balance these opposing forces, but they ultimately highlighted the deep moral and political fissures that threatened the nation's stability. International observers watched with a mix of admiration and concern. While Americans spoke of freedom and democracy, They were simultaneously tolerating a system of extreme oppression that contradicted those very ideals. The 19th century was also a time of political experimentation and civic development. The expansion of suffrage to more white men, the rise of political parties, and the growing role of local governance reflected the ongoing evolution of American democracy. Citizens engaged in vigorous debate, protests, and voting campaigns, striving to shape the nation according to the principles they valued. Yet these freedoms were unevenly distributed. Women remained largely excluded from the political process, and African Americans, especially in the South, were systematically denied basic rights. The tension between the expanding opportunities for some and the continued oppression of others became a defining feature of the era, illustrating that freedom in America was neither universal nor guaranteed. Economic transformation further complicated the landscape of liberty. The Industrial Revolution began to reshape American society, introducing new technologies, factories, and urban centers. While these changes created unprecedented opportunities for wealth and innovation, they also brought labor exploitation, harsh working conditions, and significant social inequality. Workers organized strikes and formed early labor unions, fighting for better wages, safer conditions, and the right to collective bargaining. In many ways, this struggle for economic freedom mirrored the earlier fight for political autonomy, showing that liberty encompassed more than just the absence of tyranny. It also required the ability to live with dignity and security. Internationally, the United States' rapid industrialization drew attention. Some nations admired its innovation and entrepreneurial spirit, while others criticized the social inequalities and harsh conditions that accompanied this growth, raising questions about the true cost of freedom. As tensions over slavery intensified, the nation edged closer to civil war, testing the limits of its commitment to liberty. Abolitionist movements gained momentum, advocating not just for the end of slavery, but for the recognition of African Americans as full citizens. Figures such as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman became symbols of courage and resilience, challenging a system that denied basic human rights. At the same time, political compromises increasingly failed to contain the conflict, and sectional divisions deepened. The attack on Fort Sumter in 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War, a brutal and defining struggle that would determine whether freedom in America could ever truly be universal. The Civil War was a crucible in which the nation's ideals were tested like never before. Millions of Americans, both free and enslaved, were caught in a conflict that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Soldiers fought on both sides, driven by duty, ideology, and the desire to shape the nation's future. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, issued by President Abraham Lincoln, was a landmark moment declaring the freedom of enslaved people in Confederate states. Yet even this bold declaration faced limitations and resistance, revealing the complexities of implementing freedom in a divided society. The war's end in 1865 brought victory for the Union and the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, but the promise of liberty remained incomplete, as Reconstruction would soon demonstrate. Reconstruction was a period of hope and struggle as newly freed African Americans sought to exercise their rights as citizens. The 14th and 15th Amendments aimed to guarantee equal protection under the law and voting rights for black men. Yet these legal victories were met with fierce resistance from groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and from political compromises that limited federal enforcement. Segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic racism would endure for decades, revealing that freedom required not just legal recognition but sustained social and political commitment. Internationally, the United States' efforts to navigate this post-war reconstruction drew attention from both admirers and critics. Some saw the nation as making a sincere effort to align its practices with its ideals, while others noted the enduring inequalities and questioned whether American freedom could ever truly be realized. During this era, the United States also expanded its influence abroad, beginning to emerge as a player on the global stage. Trade, diplomacy, and occasional military interventions reflected the nation's growing ambition, and foreign observers began to evaluate American freedom not just in terms of internal governance, but in relation to its actions abroad. Countries admired America's democratic institutions and the resilience of its citizens, but they also criticized the contradictions between proclaimed ideals and the realities of social and racial injustice. This tension between domestic liberty and international perception would become a recurring theme in American history, shaping how the nation was viewed and sometimes targeted by others. By the end of the 19th century, America had transformed from a fledgling collection of colonies into a continental power with a complex social, political, and economic landscape. Freedom had expanded in many ways through political participation, legal reforms, and the abolition of slavery, but it remained an incomplete promise, fraught with contradictions and challenges. The struggles of this period set the stage for the United States' emergence as a global power in the 20th century, and they revealed that liberty was not a static achievement but an ongoing journey requiring vigilance, courage, and the willingness to confront injustice at home and abroad. The story of expansion and contradiction teaches us that freedom is never a simple or uniform concept. It can inspire nations, shape societies, and motivate movements, yet it can also provoke criticism and resistance when ideals clash with practice. The United States. 19th century evolution demonstrates that liberty is not merely the absence of tyranny, but the presence of justice, equality, and opportunity. And it is this nuanced, often messy understanding of freedom that would continue to define the nation and influence how it is perceived by the world well into the 20th century. As the United States entered the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the nation faced a new era of transformation. The Industrial Revolution had taken hold, bringing with it unprecedented economic growth, technological innovation, and urbanization. Cities expanded rapidly, factories multiplied, and railroads connected distant regions, transforming the very fabric of American society. Yet with these advances came profound social challenges and questions about the meaning of freedom in a modern, industrialized world. The promises of liberty and equality hard-won through revolution, and civil war now had to contend with economic exploitation, labor unrest, and the struggle for basic human rights. In many ways, this period represented a critical test of America's commitment to freedom, not just in theory, but in the daily lives of its citizens. Industrialization created immense wealth for a small elite, but for millions of workers, life was far from free. Laborers, including women and children, worked long hours in dangerous factories, earning wages barely sufficient to survive. Tenement housing, poor sanitation, and limited access to education further constrained the opportunities for upward mobility. The gap between rich and poor grew sharply, exposing the limits of freedom for those trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. As workers began to organize, forming unions and staging strikes, they were asserting a new understanding of liberty, one that included not only political rights, but economic justice and personal dignity. Movements such as the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, and later the Industrial Workers of the World challenged the prevailing notion that freedom was solely about property ownership or voting, demanding instead a voice in the workplace and a say in the conditions of their daily lives. This struggle for economic freedom often brought workers into direct conflict with powerful industrialists and the government. Strikes like the Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894 highlighted the tensions inherent in a capitalist system where profit often outweighed human welfare. State and federal forces frequently intervened on behalf of business interests, sometimes violently, illustrating that freedom could be fragile and contingent on social and political power. These conflicts were closely watched by international observers, many of whom admired America's entrepreneurial spirit but criticized the harsh realities faced by its laboring classes. The contrast between the nation's lofty ideals of liberty and the lived experience of millions of workers underscored the ongoing struggle to define what freedom truly meant in an industrial society. Women, too, played a central role in expanding the understanding of American freedom during this period. The suffrage movement gained momentum as women organized, protested, and lobbied for the right to vote. Leaders like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and later Alice Paul argued that political participation was an essential component of liberty. and they framed their struggle as part of the broader American tradition of self-determination. The fight for women's suffrage was long and difficult, facing both legal barriers and widespread societal resistance. Yet the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 marked a landmark victory, expanding the democratic promise of freedom to include half the population and reshaping the nation's political landscape. Internationally, America's progress in women's rights was both admired and scrutinized, as countries looked to the United States as a potential model, while noting that gender inequality persisted in many areas of society. The late 19th and early 20th centuries also saw significant movements aimed at addressing social inequities and reforming government institutions. The Progressive Era, roughly spanning 1890 to 1920, brought efforts to curb political corruption, regulate industries, improve public health, and expand educational opportunities. Reformers argued that true freedom required more than legal guarantees. It required social and economic conditions that allowed citizens to live fully autonomous and meaningful lives. Legislation addressing child labor, workplace safety, food safety, and public education reflected the growing recognition that liberty was intertwined with fairness, opportunity, and protection from exploitation. These reforms further cemented the idea that freedom was an evolving concept, shaped not only by political rights but also by social responsibilities and protections. At the same time, the United States began to assert itself on the global stage, projecting its influence abroad while still grappling with unresolved questions of domestic freedom. The Spanish-American War of 1898 and subsequent territorial acquisitions in Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam introduced new debates about the rights of people under U.S. control. Was American freedom a universal principle, or was it reserved primarily for those within the continental borders? Critics, both foreign and domestic, argued that the nation's imperial ambitions contradicted its professed commitment to liberty, while supporters contended that America had a moral obligation to spread democratic ideals. This tension between domestic ideals and international actions would become a recurring theme in the countries. History influencing how other nations viewed the United States and, at times, fueling criticism and resentment. The early 20th century also brought the Great Migration, as African Americans left the oppressive conditions of the South in search of greater freedom and opportunity in northern cities. They sought economic mobility, educational access, and relief from the violent systems of racial oppression that still dominated the South. Yet in many northern cities, they encountered new forms of discrimination, segregation, and labor exploitation. The struggle of African Americans during this period highlighted that freedom was not a static achievement but an ongoing pursuit shaped by both opportunity and systemic barriers. Figures such as W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington debated the strategies for achieving liberty, equality, and social justice, emphasizing the need for both political activism and economic empowerment. World War I further complicated America's understanding of freedom. The nation's entry into the conflict in 1917 was framed as a fight to make the world safe for democracy, linking domestic liberty to global ideals. Yet at home, civil liberties were often restricted. Dissenters, labor organizers, and immigrants faced surveillance, censorship, and repression under laws such as the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. This paradox, defending freedom abroad while limiting it at home, highlighted the contradictions inherent in American democracy and drew attention from other countries, some of which questioned whether the United States truly embodied the principles it championed. Despite these challenges, the early 20th century solidified important expansions of freedom. Labor protections, women's suffrage, and social reforms reshaped the nation, creating a broader, more inclusive understanding of liberty. At the same time, the United States' growing global influence meant that the way it defined and exercised freedom had repercussions far beyond its borders. Admiration and criticism coexisted. Other nations looked to America as a laboratory of democracy, innovation, and civic progress, while also noting the contradictions, inequalities, and inconsistencies that remained unresolved. Chapter 3 illustrates a critical truth about American freedom. It is not simply a legal or political construct. but a living, evolving ideal that must adapt to social, economic, and technological change. The struggles of workers, women, and African Americans during this period expanded the definition of liberty, showing that freedom involves not only rights on paper, but tangible opportunities for self-determination, dignity, and justice. At the same time, the nation's actions abroad revealed that American freedom has always been observed, admired, and critiqued by the world, particularly when domestic ideals and international conduct appear to conflict. These lessons from the industrial age set the stage for the United States' emergence as a global power in the 20th century, highlighting the challenges, contradictions, and possibilities inherent in the ongoing evolution of liberty. As the United States entered the 20th century, the nation faced both unprecedented opportunities and profound challenges on the global stage. Having solidified its economic and political foundations, America now began to exert influence far beyond its borders, shaping international affairs while continuing to confront questions of freedom and equality at home. World War I marked a significant turning point, as the United States stepped onto the global stage not merely as a regional power, but as a force capable of influencing the balance of nations. President Woodrow Wilson framed the nation's involvement as a moral mission. The United States would help make the world safe for democracy. For many Americans, this was a natural extension of the principles fought for during the Revolution, the promotion of liberty, self-determination, and justice. Yet the contrast between these lofty ideals and the domestic reality of segregation, limited labor rights, and restricted civil liberties highlighted the ongoing contradictions of American freedom. The post-war period saw the United States grappling with both domestic and international transformations. The Roaring '20s brought economic growth, technological innovation, and social change, while also exposing deep social inequalities. Women, having won the right to vote in 1920, began to assert themselves more publicly in politics, business, and culture. African Americans, particularly through the Harlem Renaissance, celebrated artistic, cultural, and intellectual freedom, challenging stereotypes and advocating for civil rights. At the same time, nativist sentiment and racial discrimination remained pervasive, reminding the nation that freedom was still unevenly distributed. The interwar years also reflected America's growing awareness of its place in the world. The League of Nations, created after World War I to promote peace and cooperation, was ultimately rejected by the U.S. Senate, revealing tensions between isolationist tendencies and the desire to shape global norms. Internationally, this cautious approach drew mixed reactions. Some admired America's restraint, while others criticized its reluctance to commit to broader international responsibilities. The onset of World War II dramatically reshaped the nation's understanding of freedom. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 mobilized the United States in a conflict framed as a struggle against tyranny, oppression, and aggression. American soldiers fought not only to defend national sovereignty, but to protect the principles of liberty around the world. The rhetoric of freedom became central to the war effort, emphasizing democracy, human rights, and the right of nations to self-determination. Yet at the same time, domestic contradictions persisted. Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated to internment camps. African Americans faced segregation in the military, and women, while gaining employment in factories, were expected to return to domestic roles after the war. These inconsistencies underscored the fact that freedom, even in a global crusade against oppression, was imperfect at home. The conclusion of World War II marked the beginning of the United States' emergence as a global superpower. The devastation of Europe and Asia created a vacuum that America, through economic aid, diplomacy, and military presence, helped to fill. The Marshall Plan, the establishment of the United Nations, and the promotion of democratic institutions worldwide positioned the U.S. as a leader in shaping the post-war order. Freedom was framed not only as a domestic achievement, but as an international responsibility. The United States championed democracy, human rights, and the rule of law abroad, promoting the idea that liberty should extend to all peoples, not just those within its borders. However, this leadership was not without controversy. Some nations viewed American intervention as self-serving, while others questioned whether the U.S. fully embodied the freedoms it promoted, given its domestic racial inequalities and geopolitical ambitions. The Cold War era further complicated the nation's identity as a champion of freedom. Confronting the ideological challenge posed by the Soviet Union, the United States framed itself as the defender of liberty against communism. The Truman Doctrine, NATO, and global alliances positioned America as a bulwark of democracy, offering economic aid and military support to nations resisting authoritarian regimes. This period also saw the rise of civil liberties debates at home, as fears of communism led to McCarthyism and widespread suspicion of dissent. The tension between promoting freedom abroad while restricting freedoms at home revealed the complexities inherent in balancing national security, ideology, and individual rights. Internationally, allies admired America's commitment to democracy and economic development, while critics both during and after the Cold War questioned the consistency of American ideals in practice. The 20th century also witnessed profound social changes that reshaped the meaning of freedom within the United States. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s challenged systemic racial segregation and discrimination, pushing the nation to align its practices more closely with its professed ideals. Landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, sought to ensure that African Americans could fully participate in political and civic life. At the same time, other social movements, women's rights, labor rights, and the early stages of LGBTQ advocacy highlighted the expanding scope of freedom as a lived experience, rather than just a legal or theoretical principle. The successes and struggles of these movements were closely observed abroad. Other countries often cited the United States as a model of democratic progress, while also criticizing its ongoing social inequities, reflecting the dual perception of America as both a beacon of freedom and a nation still grappling with internal contradictions. America's global leadership in the 20th century was further reinforced through its role in establishing international institutions, promoting trade, and shaping post-war reconstruction. From the United Nations to the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. played a central role in creating a framework for global governance, framing freedom as both a political and economic principle. Yet the exercise of power came with scrutiny. Military interventions, covert operations, and support for certain regimes in the name of combating communism drew criticism from nations who questioned whether American actions truly promoted liberty or served geopolitical interests. This dual perception, admiration for ideals and suspicion of motives, would become a recurring feature of how other countries viewed the United States. Chapter 4 illustrates a pivotal truth about American freedom in the 20th century. It is inseparable from both domestic struggles and international responsibilities. The nation's leadership on the global stage, its advocacy for democracy, and its role in shaping post-war order exemplified the expansion of liberty beyond borders. At the same time, domestic inequalities, social movements, and civil liberties debates revealed that freedom is not a static achievement but an ongoing endeavor. By balancing the promotion of democracy abroad with the pursuit of justice at home, the United States sought to reconcile its ideals with its actions, a reconciliation that was closely monitored by allies and critics alike. The 20th century, with its wars, social movements, and global interventions, cemented the idea that American freedom is both aspirational and contested, inspiring the world while inviting scrutiny. The mid-20th century in the United States was a period of profound social transformation, a time when the nation was forced to confront the deep inequities that had long undermined its promise of freedom. The struggle for civil rights became the defining movement of this era, exposing the gap between the ideals enshrined in the Constitution and the realities experienced by millions of Americans. For African Americans, freedom had been legally recognized with the abolition of slavery and reinforced by the 14th and 15th Amendments, yet systemic segregation, disenfranchisement, and discrimination persisted, particularly in the South. Jim Crow laws enforced racial inequality, limiting access to education, employment, housing, and political participation. African Americans were citizens in name, but in practice, they faced a society that sought to curtail their liberty at every turn. This contradiction sparked a relentless fight for justice. Organizations such as the NAACP, founded in 1909, worked tirelessly through legal challenges, advocacy, and public awareness campaigns to dismantle discriminatory laws and practices. Landmark Supreme Court cases like Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared segregation in public schools unconstitutional, marked a turning point, signaling that the legal framework of American freedom could be used to challenge injustice. Yet legal victories were only the beginning. They needed to be translated into social change through activism, public pressure, and political will. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought ordinary citizens to the forefront of history. Through marches, sit-ins, boycotts, and voter registration drives, activists directly confronted the structures of oppression. Figures such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Medgar Evers, and countless unsung heroes became symbols of courage, resilience, and moral clarity. Their insistence on nonviolent protest highlighted the ethical dimensions of freedom, demonstrating that liberty was not only about legal rights but about dignity, equality, and respect. Internationally, these efforts resonated strongly. Images of peaceful protesters facing violent suppression were broadcast around the world, shaping perceptions of the United States as a nation both striving for and struggling with the realization of its core ideals. While many admired the bravery and moral clarity of the movement, others criticized the U.S. for the persistence of racial injustice, seeing a gap between American rhetoric and reality. Women's rights also emerged as a central facet of social change during this period. Building on the earlier victories of suffrage in 1920, the mid-20th century saw women challenging entrenched societal norms, advocating for equality in the workplace, education, and law. The publication of works like Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in 1963 sparked a new wave of consciousness about the limitations placed on women's freedom. Organizations such as the National Organization for Women, now founded in 1966, pushed for legislative reforms and cultural change, emphasizing that liberty must encompass both gender equality and personal autonomy. The expansion of women's rights reinforced the idea that freedom is an evolving concept, one that grows as society confronts and dismantles barriers to equality. At the same time, other marginalized groups began to assert their rights and demand recognition. Native Americans, long displaced and subjected to systemic discrimination, organized for self-determination and cultural preservation. Latino communities, particularly Mexican Americans, fought for labor rights, fair wages, and political representation. Early movements advocating for LGBTQ+ rights began to challenge societal norms, planting the seeds for broader struggles that would gain momentum in later decades. These overlapping efforts illustrated that freedom in America was not a fixed achievement but a dynamic process, constantly expanding to include those previously excluded from full participation in society. The fight for civil rights also intersected with international perceptions of American freedom. During the Cold War, the United States positioned itself as a champion of democracy and liberty on the world stage, contrasting its ideals with the oppression of communist regimes. Yet images of racial violence, segregation, and discrimination were widely reported abroad, undermining the nation's moral authority and providing propaganda material for its adversaries. Countries around the globe, particularly newly independent nations in Africa and Asia, looked to the U.S. as a model of freedom while simultaneously questioning whether it truly lived up to its professed principles. The domestic struggle for civil rights, therefore, was not only a moral and political imperative at home, but also a critical component of America's international credibility and influence. Legislative victories during this era marked important milestones in the expansion of American freedom. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation and discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, while the Voting Rights Act of 1965 secured the right to vote for African Americans, particularly in the South. These landmark laws demonstrated that legal frameworks could be used to expand liberty and protect citizens from systemic oppression. Yet enforcement required continued vigilance, and social attitudes did not change overnight. The persistence of economic inequality, residential segregation, and de facto discrimination highlighted that legal freedom alone was insufficient. True liberty demanded both structural reform and cultural transformation. The social movements of this period also reshaped the national conversation about freedom, prompting Americans to reconsider the meaning of equality, justice, and participation in a democracy. Activists framed their struggles within the language of American ideals, invoking the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the nation's historical commitment to liberty. By doing so, they highlighted the aspirational nature of freedom. It is not merely granted but actively pursued, defended, and expanded through struggle. This approach helped to solidify the idea that American freedom is not static but constantly evolving, shaped by the demands and voices of those who have been historically marginalized. Chapter 5 underscores a vital lesson: freedom in America has always been a work in progress. The mid-20th century illustrates that liberty is not a single moment of achievement, but a continuous struggle, requiring courage, activism, and societal engagement. Civil rights, women's rights, and the early stirrings of other social movements expanded the understanding of what it means to be free, challenging the nation to live up to its highest ideals. At the same time, these movements influenced how the world viewed the United States. While the nation was celebrated for its democratic aspirations and moral courage, it was also criticized for failing to ensure equality and justice for all its citizens. The dual perception, admiration for progress and critique for ongoing inequities, would become a defining feature of America's global reputation, highlighting the complexity and evolving nature of freedom in the modern era. Ultimately, the social upheavals and reforms of this period demonstrate that American freedom is inseparable from the struggles and victories of its people. It is not simply a legal concept or a historical artifact, but a living, dynamic principle that must be continually defended, challenged, and expanded. The lessons of the mid-20th century paved the way for further social change in subsequent decades, inspiring new generations to fight for inclusion, equality, and justice. They also reinforce the idea that freedom both at home and abroad is closely observed, debated, and sometimes contested by the wider world, a lesson that remains profoundly relevant in understanding America's evolving role as a symbol of liberty and a target of global scrutiny. As the United States moved into the latter part of the 20th century, it faced a new set of challenges and opportunities in both domestic and international spheres. The post-World War II era had established the nation as a global superpower, and with that position came responsibilities, influence, and scrutiny. Domestically, the gains of the civil rights movement, women's rights activism, and labor reforms had transformed the landscape of freedom, yet many struggles persisted. Social, political, and economic inequalities remained, highlighting that liberty in practice was still unevenly distributed. Meanwhile, the rapid pace of technological innovation, economic globalization, and cultural change reshaped the American experience, presenting both new avenues for personal freedom and new arenas of conflict. The 1980s and 1990s were defined by a tension between optimism and caution. The end of the Cold War brought a sense of triumph for American democracy as the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. Advocates of democracy and human rights looked to the U.S. as a model of freedom, prosperity, and technological innovation. The collapse of the Soviet Union appeared to validate decades of U.S. foreign policy framed around the defense of liberty against authoritarianism. American culture, from music to cinema to consumer goods, increasingly permeated global society, further cementing the nation's soft power. Yet this era also exposed contradictions. Economic shifts, including deindustrialization in some regions, growing income inequality, and debates over welfare and social policy, revealed that freedom was not simply a matter of political rights, but also of economic opportunity and security. For many Americans, the promise of liberty remained aspirational rather than fully realized. Technology and globalization transformed both opportunities and perceptions of freedom. The rise of personal computing, the internet, and global communication allowed citizens unprecedented access to information, the ability to express themselves, and the means to mobilize politically and socially. These tools enhanced freedom in ways unimaginable just decades earlier. Yet they also introduced new forms of control, surveillance, and inequality. The digital revolution empowered some while leaving others behind, illustrating that freedom in a modern society is complex, multifaceted, and deeply influenced by economic and technological realities. On the global stage, American innovation further reinforced the perception of the United States as a leader in progress, but it also provoked skepticism and resentment from countries concerned about cultural influence, economic dominance, or geopolitical intentions. Foreign policy during this era became a focal point of both admiration and criticism. The United States engaged in interventions, alliances, and peacekeeping missions aimed at promoting democracy, securing strategic interests, or responding to humanitarian crises. While some actions were widely praised as supporting freedom abroad, others were criticized as examples of unilateralism or overreach. Military involvements in conflicts such as Grenada, Panama, and the Gulf War highlighted the complex relationship between power and principle. Nations observed U.S. actions carefully, often balancing admiration for its democratic ideals with concern over the methods used to pursue them. This dual perception, seeing America as both a defender of liberty and a potentially dominating power, underscored the ongoing tension between national self-interest and global moral leadership. The struggle for social and political inclusion continued domestically. African Americans, women, and other marginalized communities pressed for full equality in voting, employment, education, and representation. Civil rights legislation from previous decades was enforced and expanded, yet systemic challenges persisted, including disparities in wealth, healthcare, and access to political power. LGBTQ+ rights gained visibility, culminating in early victories such as anti-discrimination ordinances, though the fight for marriage equality and broader legal protections would continue into the 21st century. These movements emphasized that freedom is not static. It is continuously negotiated and redefined through activism, legislation, and cultural change. For the United States, the expansion of rights during this era reinforced the idea that liberty is both a domestic responsibility and a measure of national character. The 1990s also saw the United States engaging in global peacekeeping and humanitarian interventions, including in the Balkans and Somalia, reflecting the nation's growing role as a moral and military arbiter. These actions highlighted the challenge of translating domestic ideals of freedom into foreign policy. The world watched closely. Allies often praised American leadership in promoting stability and human rights, while critics accused the U.S. of overstepping sovereignty or prioritizing strategic interests over universal liberty. Such scrutiny demonstrated that American freedom is never perceived in isolation. It is always evaluated in the context of international behavior, policy decisions, and cultural influence. Economic globalization during this period reshaped the relationship between freedom and opportunity. Free trade, multinational corporations, and the rise of global markets created unprecedented prosperity for some while contributing to dislocation and inequality for others. Workers in declining industries faced unemployment and insecurity, while entrepreneurs and technology professionals benefited from new avenues of wealth and innovation. This duality illustrated that freedom encompasses more than formal rights. It includes the capacity to thrive economically, participate meaningfully in society, and access the tools necessary for self-determination. Internationally, these economic shifts reinforced both admiration and criticism. The U.S. was celebrated as a model of innovation and opportunity, but was also accused of economic dominance, exploitation, and cultural hegemony. Culturally, the late 20th century further emphasized the complex nature of freedom. American values individualism, self-expression, and the pursuit of personal fulfillment spread globally through media, film, music, and literature. These cultural exports reinforced perceptions of the U.S. as a beacon of liberty and innovation. Yet cultural influence can also provoke resistance, particularly in societies with differing values, traditions, or concerns about American dominance. The United States, as a global symbol of freedom, was simultaneously admired, emulated, and challenged, reflecting the nuanced and often contradictory ways in which liberty is perceived worldwide. Chapter 6 underscores that modern American freedom is a multidimensional concept. shaped by domestic progress, social movements, technological innovation, and international influence. The gains of the mid-20th century civil rights, women's rights, labor protections, and expanded political participation laid the foundation for a more inclusive understanding of liberty, even as economic, social, and political inequalities persisted. Globally, the United States' position as a superpower magnified both its achievements and its contradictions, making it a target of both admiration and critique. The era illustrates that freedom is never absolute. It evolves with society, technology, and international context. In the modern age, liberty is measured not only by legal rights or political frameworks, but also by access to opportunity, security, and cultural expression, both at home and abroad. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that the United States' journey toward a more complete realization of freedom is ongoing. The late 20th century highlights the interplay between domestic progress and global responsibility, demonstrating that liberty is both an internal aspiration and a principle with worldwide consequences. As the nation entered the 21st century, it carried forward the lessons of this era, that freedom is dynamic, contested, and deeply interconnected with the way America is perceived and engaged with by the broader world. As the United States entered the 21st century, the meaning of freedom evolved once again, reflecting new challenges, opportunities, and global scrutiny. The promise of liberty, legal, political, and economic, had expanded over centuries through struggle, activism, and reform. Yet it remained an ongoing project, constantly tested by domestic and international circumstances. The early decades of the 2000s highlighted both the progress achieved and the vulnerabilities inherent in a society navigating complex global dynamics, technological change, and social polarization. Freedoms that had once seemed secure were now reframed within the context of security, technology, and global interconnectedness, revealing that liberty in the modern era is far more intricate than in any previous period. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 represented a profound inflection point in the American understanding of freedom. In response, the U.S. government implemented policies intended to protect national security, including the Patriot Act, expanded surveillance, and military interventions abroad. While these measures were framed as necessary to preserve liberty, they sparked intense debate over the balance between security and civil liberties. Critics argued that rights to privacy, due process, and free expression were being compromised, raising fundamental questions about the true meaning of freedom in a society confronting external threats. These domestic debates were closely watched around the world, with allies and adversaries alike evaluating whether America's response to terrorism aligned with the democratic principles it had long championed. Some nations admired the resilience and resolve of the United States, while others criticized policies they perceived as encroaching on human rights, illustrating the dual perception that has long accompanied American freedom. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq further complicated global perceptions of liberty. Framed as efforts to promote democracy and protect human rights, these interventions were initially welcomed by some who saw America as defending the ideals of freedom. Yet over time, the prolonged conflicts, civilian casualties, and instances of human rights violations raised questions about the consistency and morality of U.S. foreign policy. Critics argued that the pursuit of national interest often overshadowed the promotion of universal liberty, reinforcing the perception that freedom abroad could be selectively applied. Allies and adversaries alike debated whether American actions reflected genuine commitment to human rights or the strategic exercise of power, underscoring the enduring tension between ideals and practice that has characterized U.S. history. Domestically, freedom continued to be shaped by ongoing social movements and evolving cultural norms. Issues such as LGBTQ+ rights, gender equality, racial justice, and immigrant rights became central to the national conversation. The legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015 marked a historic expansion of civil liberty, reflecting the idea that freedom must encompass not only legal rights but also the recognition and affirmation of individual identity. Movements such as Black Lives Matter and campaigns for immigration reform highlighted ongoing disparities in equality, policing, and economic opportunity, demonstrating that liberty is inseparable from justice, inclusion, and accountability. These struggles reinforce the notion that American freedom is dynamic, constantly redefined by the efforts of those seeking to expand its reach and meaning. The digital age has further transformed the landscape of liberty, creating new arenas for expression, activism, and surveillance. Social media platforms, instant communication, and access to information have empowered citizens to participate in political discourse, organize movements, and hold institutions accountable in unprecedented ways. At the same time, concerns about misinformation, algorithmic bias, and government or corporate surveillance reveal the complexities of modern freedom. The ability to speak, learn, and mobilize in the digital era is both a profound opportunity and a source of vulnerability, highlighting that liberty is inseparable from responsibility, ethics, and vigilance. Internationally, America's digital culture has amplified its soft power, spreading ideas of individual freedom, innovation, and democracy, while also provoking criticism regarding privacy, influence, and dominance. Economic inequality continues to shape perceptions of freedom in the modern United States. Access to quality education, healthcare, housing, and employment opportunities remains uneven, illustrating that legal or political rights alone do not guarantee true liberty. Social mobility, economic security, and access to opportunity are increasingly recognized as essential components of freedom, reflecting the idea that liberty is multidimensional. These domestic realities influence how the world perceives America, a nation celebrated for innovation, entrepreneurship, and democratic principles, yet scrutinized for disparities that challenge its moral authority and global credibility. Countries observing U.S. policies and social dynamics often weigh the nation's achievements against its shortcomings, continuing the long-standing pattern of admiration mixed with criticism. Globalization and America's role as a superpower further complicate modern perceptions of freedom. U.S. economic, military, and cultural influence extends across continents, shaping international norms, markets, and political structures. While this influence allows America to promote democratic ideals and human rights, it also provokes resistance, skepticism, and critique from nations concerned about sovereignty, inequality, or perceived cultural imposition. The duality of being both a symbol of liberty and a target of scrutiny reflects a historical pattern. As American freedom expands its reach, it inevitably invites observation, challenge, and debate. This dynamic underscores the complexity of modern liberty, illustrating that national ideals cannot be separated from global context. The 21st century has also seen an increasing recognition that freedom is collective as well as individual. Movements addressing climate change, social justice, and international human rights emphasize the interconnectedness of liberty, responsibility, and sustainability. American citizens and institutions are called not only to safeguard individual freedoms, but also to ensure that liberty is compatible with ethical governance, environmental stewardship, and global cooperation. This broadened understanding of freedom reflects the ongoing evolution of American ideals, demonstrating that liberty is not a static achievement but a continuous negotiation shaped by social, economic, political, and environmental realities. Chapter 7 highlights a central truth: freedom today is complex, contested, and global. The United States, as both a domestic society and an international actor, continues to grapple with the tensions between ideals and realities. From domestic civil liberties and social movements to foreign interventions and global influence, American freedom is constantly observed, debated, and evaluated both at home and abroad. The dual perception: admiration for innovation, democracy, and progress alongside criticism for inequalities, inconsistencies, or overreach, illustrates the enduring challenge of aligning principles with practice. It also demonstrates that liberty is dynamic, requiring vigilance, adaptation, and moral engagement in every era. Ultimately, the modern era shows that American freedom is neither absolute nor complete, but a living experiment. It is shaped by the actions of citizens, the pressures of global events, and the interplay of social, political, and economic forces. While the United States remains a symbol of liberty and opportunity, its journey toward fully realizing those ideals is ongoing, reflecting both the nation's achievements and its challenges. By understanding the complexities of freedom today, we can better appreciate the historical trajectory of liberty, the struggles that have expanded it, and the responsibilities that come with preserving it in a rapidly changing world. The story of American freedom in the modern era reminds us that liberty is always evolving, always contested, and always in dialogue with both domestic realities and international perceptions. As we reach the present day, the story of American freedom stands as both a testament to progress and a reminder of ongoing challenges. Over more than 4 centuries, the United States has transformed from a collection of colonies seeking self-governance into a nation with global influence, economic power, and cultural reach. Throughout this journey, the ideals of liberty, political rights, civil liberties, social equality, and human dignity have expanded and evolved, often in response to struggle, activism, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Yet at the same time, freedom has never been universal or complete. Each generation has faced its own contradictions, balancing opportunity with inequality, ideals with reality, and national interests with global perception. The story of freedom in America is, above all, a story of ongoing evolution. In the 21st century, freedom in the United States is shaped by a complex interplay of domestic and international forces. Social movements continue to push the boundaries of liberty, advocating for racial equality, gender equity, LGBTQ+ rights, immigrant protections, and economic justice. The digital revolution has transformed the way citizens access information, express themselves, and participate in civic life, enabling new forms of activism and engagement. Yet these same technologies introduce challenges, from misinformation and privacy, concerns to surveillance and censorship, highlighting that liberty is inseparable from responsibility and ethics. Economic disparities, healthcare access, and educational opportunities also remain central to the conversation about freedom, reminding us that legal rights alone are insufficient to guarantee genuine autonomy and opportunity. Globally, the United States' position as a superpower means that its actions are constantly scrutinized, celebrated, and criticized. America's military interventions, foreign policy decisions, economic influence, and cultural exports shape the perception of liberty far beyond its borders. Some nations admire the United States as a defender of democracy, human rights, and innovation, while others view its influence as overreaching, self-serving, or inconsistent with the principles it espouses. This dual perception has been a recurring theme throughout American history. The nation is simultaneously a symbol of freedom and a target for critique, with each action interpreted in light of both its domestic ideals and its global ambitions. Understanding this duality is essential to grasping the full scope of what American freedom represents in the modern world. The challenges of contemporary America also illustrate that freedom is an ongoing negotiation between ideals and reality. Debates over voting rights, police reform, economic inequality, immigration policy, and civil liberties reflect the constant tension between inclusion and exclusion, opportunity and constraint. These debates are not unique to the United States, but they carry special weight because of the nation's historical role as a model for democracy and liberty. How America resolves these tensions affects not only its citizens, but also its credibility and influence on the global stage. In this sense, domestic struggles over freedom are inseparable from international perception, and the two realms are constantly in dialogue. Freedom in America today is also defined by its diversity. The nation is more heterogeneous than ever before, with communities representing a vast array of cultures, religions, languages, and experiences. This diversity enriches the nation, expanding the understanding of liberty to include the rights and dignity of all people, regardless of background. Yet it also poses challenges, as differing perspectives and competing interests require negotiation, compromise, and continual reflection on the principles that unite the country. The evolution of freedom in this context is not linear or uncontested. It is dynamic, reflecting the ongoing effort to reconcile individual autonomy with collective responsibility and justice. Internationally, the United States remains both admired and critiqued. Its model of democratic governance, economic opportunity, and cultural innovation continues to inspire people worldwide. At the same time, global observers often question whether the nation consistently lives up to the ideals it promotes, particularly in areas such as racial equity, economic fairness, and foreign interventions. This tension between aspiration and practice reflects the enduring challenge of American freedom. The nation's power and influence amplify both its successes and its shortcomings, making it a target for both admiration and scrutiny. Understanding this duality is crucial to appreciating the full scope of liberty as it exists today. The history of American freedom also teaches that liberty is not static. It must be actively defended, expanded, and redefined. From the early colonial assemblies to the revolutionary